Rage has a way of tearing through more than fabric. When billionaire Robert Sterling's fury exploded in that upscale restaurant, ripping through a waitress's sleeve in a moment of unhinged entitlement, he never expected to uncover the one truth that would shatter his carefully constructed world. The small tattoo on Emily's exposed arm, a delicate constellation of stars arranged in a pattern he'd memorized 23 years ago, stopped his heart cold. Subscribe to witness how one moment of violence became the key to unlocking a lifetime of searching. The crystal chandelier above cast fractured light across the mahogany tables of Le Bernardin, where power lunches were served, alongside $30 appetizers and the quiet hum of wealth-exchanged hands through whispered conversations. Robert Sterling sat rigid in his corner booth, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the documents spread before him like battle plans, each page representing another million-dollar acquisition that would cement his empire's dominance in the tech industry. His Armani suit, tailored to perfection, couldn't hide the tension radiating from his broad shoulders, the kind of stress that came from building a fortune while carrying the weight of a 23-year-old wound that never quite healed. The merger papers demanded his signature, but his mind kept drifting to the empty chair across from him, the one that should have been occupied by his daughter on her birthday, if she had lived to see this day. He'd built this empire partly as a monument to her memory, partly as a distraction from the guilt that gnawed at him like acid, eating away at whatever humanity he'd once possessed. The restaurant's ambient noise, the gentle clink of silverware, the soft murmur of conversations, the occasional laugh from nearby tables, felt like mockery to his ears, a reminder that the world continued to spin, while his had stopped the day she disappeared. Emily Martinez moved between the tables with practiced grace, her 23 years of life etched in the careful way she balanced multiple plates while navigating the maze of chairs and designer handbags that littered the floor like expensive obstacles. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail that revealed the elegant curve of her neck, and her uniform, a simple black dress with long sleeves, fit her slender frame in a way that spoke of someone who took pride in her appearance, despite working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She'd been on her feet for 6 hours straight, serving entitled customers who barely acknowledged her existence, but she maintained her professional smile because this job, unlike her morning shift at the coffee shop or her weekend work at the bookstore, actually paid enough to cover her night school tuition. The constellation tattoo on her upper arm remained hidden beneath the fabric of her sleeve, a secret she'd carried since her 18th birthday, when she'd finally had enough money to commemorate the only memory she had of her early childhood. A father who used to point out stars and tell her stories about brave princesses who lived among them. She approached Robert's table with the same careful attention she gave all her customers, unaware that she was walking toward a collision that would reshape both their destinies. Her notepad was ready, her pen poised, her smile genuine despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her as she prepared to take his order. The spilled wine happened in slow motion, a cascade of deep red Bordeaux that spread across Robert's merger documents like blood across a battlefield, destroying hours of legal work and months of careful negotiation in a matter of seconds. Emily's hand trembled as she realized what had happened, her face draining of color as she watched the expensive liquid seep into papers worth more than she'd earned in a lifetime, transforming crucial signatures into illegible smears and reducing complex legal language to wine-stained gibberish. She'd been reaching across the table to refill his water glass when her elbow caught the wine bottle, sending it tumbling in an arc that seemed to last forever before gravity claimed its victory, and chaos erupted across the pristine white tablecloth. Her apologies came in a rush of panicked words, her hands already reaching for napkins as she tried to salvage what she could, but the damage was done, and she could see the fury building in Robert's eyes like a storm gathering strength before it unleashed its full power. The other diners had stopped their conversations to watch the drama unfold, their faces a mixture of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment as they witnessed what was clearly about to become an ugly scene. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as she dabbed frantically at the papers, knowing that no amount of cleaning would restore what had been lost, knowing that her clumsiness had just cost her the best-paying job she'd ever had. Robert's rage erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for decades, all his grief and frustration and carefully controlled anger finding a target in the young woman who had just destroyed his life's work with a single careless gesture. He shot to his feet with such violence that his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent restaurant like a gunshot. And his voice, when it came, was a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "You stupid, worthless girl!" he bellowed, his face flushed red with fury as he towered over Emily's cringing form, his hands clenched into fists that trembled with the effort of restraining himself from physical violence. The words poured out of him like poison, each syllable designed to wound and humiliate, to transfer his pain onto someone else, because he couldn't bear to carry it alone anymore. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Those papers were worth more than you'll ever be worth in your pathetic excuse for a life." His voice carried across the restaurant, causing other patrons to shift uncomfortably in their seats, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a viral moment in the making. Emily shrank back from his verbal assault, her eyes filling with tears that she fought desperately to hold back, knowing that crying would only make things worse, would only confirm his assessment of her as weak and worthless. The other staff members watched from a distance, too intimidated by Robert's obvious wealth and power to intervene, leaving Emily to face his wrath alone. The moment his hand shot out to grab her arm, Emily instinctively pulled away, but Robert's grip was iron-strong, fueled by years of gym workouts and a lifetime of getting what he wanted through force when charm failed him. His fingers dug into the fabric of her sleeve with such violence that the seams couldn't hold, and the sound of tearing cloth cut through his shouted accusations like a knife through silk, sudden and sharp and irreversible. The sleeve ripped from shoulder to elbow in one clean tear, exposing the pale skin of Emily's upper arm to the harsh restaurant lighting and the shocked stares of everyone present. But it wasn't her skin that stopped Robert's tirade mid-sentence. It was the tattoo that decorated her arm, like a roadmap to his past. 7 small stars arranged in the exact pattern of the Pleiades constellation, each one perfectly placed according to astronomical charts, each one a mirror image of the drawing he'd made for his daughter on her 5th birthday, the last gift he'd given her before she vanished from his life forever. The tattoo was delicate and beautiful, clearly the work of a skilled artist, but it was the meaning behind it that hit Robert like a physical blow, stealing his breath and stopping his heart as recognition dawned with the force of a revelation. His hand released her arm as if he'd been burned, and he staggered backward, his face cycling through emotions too complex and overwhelming to process. Shock, disbelief, hope, terror, and a grief so profound it threatened to bring him to his knees. The restaurant had fallen into complete silence, the kind of absolute quiet that follows a catastrophe, where even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what would come next. Emily stood frozen in place, her torn sleeve hanging in tatters around her exposed arm, her tattoo on full display for everyone to see, but her attention was focused entirely on the man who had just assaulted her and was now staring at her with an expression she couldn't begin to interpret. Robert's face had gone from red with rage to white with shock, his eyes fixed on her tattoo with an intensity that made her skin crawl, as if he was seeing a ghost or witnessing a miracle, and she instinctively covered the stars with her other hand, suddenly feeling more exposed than if she'd been standing naked in the middle of the restaurant. The other diners whispered among themselves, their phones out and recording, capturing every moment of what was clearly a breakdown in progress, but Emily couldn't focus on them. All she could see was the way Robert's hands shook as he reached toward her, then pulled back, then reached again as if he wanted to touch her, but was afraid she might disappear if he tried. "Where did you get that tattoo?" he whispered, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him, so different from the roar of moments before that it seemed to come from a completely different person. The question hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither of them was sure they wanted to cross, loaded with implications and possibilities that could change everything or destroy them both. And Emily found herself unable to answer, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare into the eyes of a stranger who was looking at her like she held the key to his salvation. Emily's voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat constricted with fear and confusion as she tried to process what was happening. Why this man who had just humiliated her in front of an entire restaurant was now looking at her with such desperate intensity, as if her answer might determine whether he lived or died. "I got it when I turned 18, she managed to say, her free hand still covering the constellation protectively, instinctively shielding herself from his penetrating stare that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed defenses. The tattoo had been her first act of rebellion, her first real decision as an adult, a way to honor the only clear memory she had of her early childhood, a man's voice telling her stories about brave princesses who lived among the stars, pointing out constellations in the night sky while she sat on his lap and felt completely safe and loved. She'd never been able to remember his face clearly, just fragments, kind eyes, gentle hands, the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely masculine, but the memory of those star stories had sustained her through years of foster homes and group facilities, through the loneliness of growing up without knowing where she came from or who she really was. The tattoo artist had been confused by her specific requirements, the exact positioning of each star according to astronomical charts she'd researched obsessively, but she'd insisted on perfection because those stars were all she had left of whoever had loved her before the world became cold and uncertain. Now, standing in this upscale restaurant with her sleeve torn and her secret exposed, she felt like that 5-year-old girl again, small and vulnerable, and desperately wanting someone to tell her that everything would be okay. Robert's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed back into his chair with such force that the remaining wine glasses on the table rattled ominously, threatening to complete the destruction that had already begun with Emily's accident. His hands covered his face as if he could hide from the truth that was staring him in the face, but when he looked up again, the tattoo was still there, still perfect, still exactly as he'd drawn it for his daughter, 23 years ago when she'd asked him to show her where the princess stars lived. "Stella," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer, like a confession, like a word he'd been afraid to speak aloud for more than 2 decades, because saying it made the loss real, made the emptiness in his chest expand until it threatened to consume him entirely. His daughter's name, not Emily, but Stella, the little star who had lit up his world until the day she vanished, taken by his ex-wife in a custody battle that had turned vicious and destructive, disappearing into a system that had swallowed them both without a trace, despite his millions and his lawyers and his desperate searching. He'd hired private investigators, offered rewards, followed every lead no matter how tenuous, but they'd simply vanished as if they'd never existed, leaving him with nothing but memories and a drawing of 7 stars that he'd kept in his wallet for 23 years, worn and faded, but never forgotten. The resemblance was there now that he was looking for it. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the way she held herself with a dignity that reminded him of his own mother. But it was the tattoo that provided the proof his heart needed, the confirmation that the universe had just handed him back the most precious thing he'd ever lost. The restaurant manager appeared at their table like a nervous ghost, his face pale, with the understanding that whatever was happening between his customer and his employee was far beyond anything his training had prepared him to handle. "Sir, Perhaps we should move this conversation to a more private location, he suggested, in the kind of carefully modulated voice that spoke of years spent managing crises and containing scandals. But Robert waved him away with an impatient gesture, his attention completely focused on the young woman who stood before him like a miracle wrapped in a torn uniform. Emily looked between them with growing alarm, sensing that she was at the center of something much larger and more complicated than a simple workplace accident, something that involved her in ways she couldn't begin to understand, but that filled her with a creeping dread that made her want to run from the restaurant and never look back. The other diners had given up any pretense of eating and were openly staring now, their phones capturing every moment of what was clearly becoming the most dramatic scene any of them had ever witnessed. But Emily felt like she was watching it all happen to someone else, as if she'd stepped outside her own body and was observing from a distance as her carefully ordered life began to unravel. She'd worked so hard to build something stable, to create a future for herself, despite having no past to build on. And now this stranger was looking at her with recognition that she didn't understand, speaking a name that meant nothing to her, but seemed to mean everything to him. The fear that had started as a flutter in her stomach was growing into something larger and more consuming, a terror that whatever he was about to tell her would change everything she thought she knew about herself. "You don't remember me, do you?" Robert asked, his voice breaking on the words as he studied her face with the desperate intensity of a man trying to find traces of the child he'd lost in the features of the woman she'd become. Emily shook her head slowly, her dark eyes wide with confusion and growing fear, and he felt his heart break all over again because of course she wouldn't remember. She'd been so young when they'd been separated, just 5 years old. And 23 years was a lifetime when you were starting from nothing. He wanted to reach out and touch her face, to trace the familiar features that had haunted his dreams for more than 2 decades, but he could see how frightened she was, how his earlier rage had traumatized her, and he forced himself to keep his distance, even though every instinct screamed at him to pull her into his arms and never let her go again. "Your mother," he said carefully, watching her face for any flicker of recognition. "Her name was Diana Martinez. She had dark hair like yours, and she used to sing you lullabies in Spanish while she braided your hair." Emily's face went even paler at the mention of her mother's name, a name she'd carried with her through the foster system, but had never heard spoken aloud by anyone who had actually known the woman who'd given birth to her. The social workers had told her that her mother had died when she was young, that there were no other relatives, no one to claim her, but they'd never provided details, never explained how she'd ended up alone in the world with nothing but a first name and a social security number to prove she existed. Now this stranger was speaking about her mother as if he'd known her intimately, as if he'd been there for those lullabies and hair-braiding sessions that Emily couldn't remember but somehow felt in her bones. The truth hit Emily like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs wobble beneath her as the implications of what Robert was suggesting began to sink in with devastating clarity. "You're saying you're my father," she whispered, the words feeling foreign and impossible on her tongue because she'd spent her entire life believing she was alone in the world, that whoever had created her had abandoned her without a second thought. The man sitting before her was clearly wealthy beyond imagination, powerful enough to destroy her with a word, old enough to have been an adult when she was born, and he was looking at her with such raw emotion that she couldn't doubt his sincerity, even though her mind rebelled against accepting what he was telling her. If he was really her father, then where had he been for the past 18 years, while she'd struggled through the foster system, working multiple jobs to pay for school, sleeping in her car when she couldn't make rent, dreaming of a family that she'd convinced herself didn't exist? The anger that rose in her chest was hot and immediate, mixing with the shock and confusion to create a cocktail of emotions so intense she thought she might be sick right there on the expensive carpet. "If you're my father," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, Then where the hell have you been? The question hung between them like an accusation, loaded with 23 years of abandonment and loneliness, and Robert flinched as if she'd slapped him, because he knew he deserved her anger, knew that no explanation would ever be enough to justify the years she'd spent believing she was unwanted and alone. The restaurant around them had faded into background noise, the other diners and staff becoming irrelevant as father and daughter faced each other across a chasm of lost time and broken trust that might never be bridged. Robert's explanation came in broken fragments, his voice thick with emotion as he tried to compress 23 years of searching and grief into words that could somehow make Emily understand the magnitude of what had been stolen from both of them. "Your mother took you when you were 5, he said, his hands shaking as he pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn photograph that he'd carried with him every day since she'd disappeared. A picture of a little girl with dark hair and bright eyes sitting on his shoulders at a carnival, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. We were going through a bitter divorce, and she was afraid the court would give me custody because of my money, my lawyers, so she ran with you in the middle of the night and changed both your names, disappeared into the system where I couldn't find you." Emily stared at the photograph with growing recognition, not of the memory itself, but of the feeling it evoked, a sense of safety and joy that she'd carried somewhere deep inside her without understanding where it came from. And she realized that the man in the picture was indeed the same person who sat before her now, aged by grief and time, but unmistakably the source of her few happy childhood memories. "I hired every private investigator I could find, offered rewards, followed every lead, but you'd vanished completely," Robert continued, his voice breaking as he relived the helplessness and desperation that had consumed him for more than 2 decades. "I never stopped looking for you, never stopped hoping that someday I'd find you again. But I never imagined it would happen like this, in a place like this, after I'd just—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the horror of what he'd done to his own daughter, how his rage and pain had led him to attack the very person he'd spent his life trying to find. And Emily could see the self-loathing in his eyes as he realized that their reunion had been tainted by his own cruelty and violence. Emily's world tilted on its axis as she stared at the photograph, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the image of herself as a child, a little girl who looked so happy and carefree that it seemed like a different person entirely. Someone who had never known hunger or loneliness or the crushing weight of believing she was unwanted by everyone who mattered. The carnival in the background was a blur of bright colors and spinning lights, but she could see the joy radiating from both figures in the picture, the easy intimacy between father and daughter that spoke of bedtime stories and morning pancakes and all the small rituals that make up a loving family. "I remember this," she whispered, her voice barely audible as fragments of memory began to surface, like pieces of a puzzle she'd thought was lost forever, images of cotton candy and carousel horses and strong arms lifting her high above the crowd so she could see everything from a magical vantage point. The man in the photograph was younger, his hair darker and his face unlined by the grief that had carved deep grooves around his eyes. But she could see the same gentle hands that had pointed out constellations, the same voice that had told her stories about brave princesses who lived among the stars and never had to be afraid because their fathers would always protect them. The memory was so vivid and unexpected that it brought tears to her eyes, not just for what she'd lost, but for what she'd never known she'd had. A father who had loved her enough to carry her picture for 23 years, who had never stopped searching even when hope seemed impossible. The foster families she'd lived with had been kind enough, but none of them had ever looked at her the way Robert was looking at her now, as if she was the most precious thing in the world, as if finding her again was worth more than all his billions combined. Robert watched his daughter's face as recognition dawned, saw the exact moment when the walls she'd built around her heart began to crack and crumble, revealing the vulnerable child who had never stopped hoping that someone, somewhere, was looking for her, with the same desperate intensity that had driven him to the edge of madness more times than he could count. "You used to call me Daddy Bear," he said softly, his voice thick with unshed tears as he shared details that only a father would know, intimate memories that proved beyond any doubt that he was telling the truth about their connection. "And you had a stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts that you couldn't sleep without, and you insisted on wearing your princess dress to the grocery store because you said regular clothes were too boring for someone who lived in a castle." Emily's breath caught in her throat as each detail hit her like a physical blow, unlocking memories she'd buried so deep she'd convinced herself they were just dreams, fantasies created by a lonely child who needed to believe she'd once been loved. The elephant had been grey and worn, with one ear that was slightly chewed from years of comfort-seeking, and she could suddenly remember the weight of it in her arms, the way it smelled like home and safety and everything good in the world. The princess dress had been pink and sparkly, with a full skirt that twirled when she spun around, and she could feel the ghost of that fabric against her legs, the way it had made her feel beautiful and special and worthy of love. These weren't just memories, they were proof of a life she'd lived before everything went wrong, evidence that she hadn't always been alone, that someone had once cherished her enough to remember every small detail of her existence. The restaurant around them had become a stage for the most private moment of their lives, with dozens of strangers witnessing the reunion that should have happened in private, away from cameras and curious eyes. But neither Robert nor Emily seemed aware of their audience anymore, as they navigated the treacherous territory of reconnection after decades of separation. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" Emily asked, her voice raw with pain as she struggled to understand how someone with Robert's resources could have failed to locate her for so long, how she could have spent years aging out of the foster system while her father lived in luxury just a few hundred miles away. The question was loaded with accusation and hurt, but also with a desperate need to understand, to make sense of a system that had failed them both so completely that they'd lived parallel lives without ever knowing the other was searching. Robert's face crumpled with guilt and self-recrimination as he tried to explain the impossible complexity of what had happened. How Diana had been clever and desperate enough to create new identities that even his best investigators couldn't penetrate. How the system had been designed to protect children from abusive parents and had ended up protecting Emily from the father who loved her more than life itself. "Your mother was brilliant," he said, his voice filled with grudging admiration for the woman who had destroyed his life while trying to save their daughters. "She created a paper trail that led nowhere, used connections I didn't know she had, disappeared so completely that it was like you'd never existed at all." The words hit Emily like physical blows because they confirmed her worst fears about her own existence, the nagging suspicion that she was somehow forgettable, disposable, not worth the effort it would take to find her. The weight of lost years pressed down on them both like a physical force. 23 years of birthdays and holidays and milestones that should have been shared but had instead been endured in isolation. Each of them carrying a wound that had never healed because the other half of their hearts had been missing. Emily thought about all the times she'd wondered what her father was like, whether he ever thought about her, whether he would be proud of the woman she'd become despite the odds stacked against her. And now she was looking at a man who had clearly been destroyed by her absence, whose success and wealth meant nothing compared to the daughter he'd lost. "I graduated valedictorian from high school," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if she needed to prove her worth, to show him that she'd made something of herself, despite being abandoned. "I'm studying to be a teacher, working 3 jobs to pay for school, and I've never been arrested or done drugs or any of the things people expect from foster kids." Muddy, the pride in her voice, was mixed with defiance, as if she was daring him to be disappointed in her, to find her lacking after all these years of searching. But Robert's face lit up with such pure joy and pride that it took her breath away. "I knew you'd be extraordinary," he whispered, his voice breaking as he realized that his little girl had grown into exactly the kind of woman he'd hoped she would become, strong and determined and brilliant, despite everything the world had thrown at her. "I used to imagine what you'd be like when you grew up, what you'd choose to do with your life, and I always knew you'd want to help people, to make the world better somehow." The fact that she'd chosen teaching, a profession dedicated to nurturing and protecting children, seemed like cosmic justice to him, proof that some essential part of her nature had survived intact despite the trauma of their separation. The moment stretched between them like a bridge made of hope and fear, both of them afraid to move too fast, to assume too much, to risk destroying this fragile connection before it had a chance to grow into something real and lasting. Emily could see the love in Robert's eyes, but she could also see the guilt and the desperate need for forgiveness, and she wasn't sure she was ready to give him what he needed. Wasn't sure she could simply erase 23 years of abandonment with a single conversation, no matter how revelatory it might be. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice small and uncertain as she gestured between them, acknowledging the impossibility of their situation. "I don't know how to be someone's daughter after all this time, how to trust that you won't disappear again, how to believe that this is real and not just some cruel joke the universe is playing on me." Her honesty was brutal and necessary, cutting through the emotion to the practical reality of what they were facing. Two strangers who shared DNA and a handful of memories, trying to rebuild a relationship that had been severed when she was too young to understand what she was losing. Robert nodded slowly, understanding that he couldn't expect instant forgiveness or immediate trust, that he would have to earn his place in her life one day at a time, proving through actions rather than words that he was worthy of being called her father. "I don't know how to do this either," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I want to learn, if you'll let me. I want to know everything about the woman you've become, and I want to try to make up for all the years I missed, even though I know that's impossible." The restaurant manager appeared again, more insistent this time as he realized that the scene playing out at table 12 was attracting unwanted attention from other patrons and would likely end up on social media within the hour, potentially damaging the establishment's reputation for discretion and exclusivity. "Sir, I really must insist that we move this conversation to a private dining room," he said, his voice carefully controlled but tinged with the kind of authority that came from years of managing high-profile clients and their various crises. Robert looked around for the first time since seeing Emily's tattoo, suddenly aware of the dozens of phones pointed in their direction. The whispered conversations and barely concealed excitement of people who had stumbled onto what was clearly a major story in the making. "Yes," he said quickly, rising from his chair and extending his hand toward Emily, with the careful courtesy of someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Please, let's go somewhere we can talk privately." Emily hesitated for a moment, torn between the desire to flee from this overwhelming situation and the desperate need to understand what was happening to her, to learn more about the father she'd thought was dead or simply didn't care enough to find her. The torn sleeve of her uniform hung in tatters around her arm, exposing the tattoo that had started this entire revelation, and she suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with her physical state of undress. Subscribe to discover how this impossible reunion will reshape both their worlds forever, as father and daughter navigate the treacherous path from strangers to family. The private dining room was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, with oil paintings of hunting scenes adorning the walls, and a massive table that could seat 20, but now felt intimate, with just the two of them sitting across from each other like negotiators trying to broker a peace treaty between their wounded hearts. Emily had accepted the manager's offer of a replacement uniform, but she'd kept her torn sleeve as evidence of the moment that had changed everything, folding it carefully and placing it in her purse like a talisman that proved this wasn't all an elaborate dream from which she would soon wake up alone in her studio apartment. Robert had ordered coffee for both of them, but neither had touched their cups, too focused on the delicate work of rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by forces beyond their control, too afraid that any sudden movement might break the spell that had brought them back together after more than 2 decades of separation. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and carefully guarded hopes, each of them trying to find the right words to bridge a gap that seemed both infinite and impossibly narrow, depending on the angle from which you viewed it. Emily studied her father's face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail, searching for traces of the man who had lifted her onto his shoulders and told her stories about brave princesses. But all she could see was the weight of years spent searching for something that had always been just out of reach. His hands, which had seemed so large and strong in her childhood memories, now looked older and more fragile, marked by liver spots and the fine tremor that came from too much stress and too little sleep, and she found herself wondering what other changes time had wrought in the man who had once been her entire world. Robert broke the silence first, his voice carefully controlled as he tried to navigate the minefield of their shared history without triggering any more emotional explosions that might drive his daughter away before they'd had a chance to truly reconnect. "I need you to know that not a day went by that I didn't think about you," he said, his eyes fixed on her face as if he was afraid she might disappear if he looked away for even a moment. "I kept your room exactly the way it was when you left, down to the stuffed animals on your bed and the drawings you'd made taped to the walls, because I couldn't bear the thought of accepting that you were really gone." Emily felt her throat tighten at the image of a shrine to her childhood, a museum of memories that had been preserved like artifacts from a lost civilization, and she wondered what it must have been like for him to walk past that room every day, to be reminded constantly of what he'd lost and might never recover. The idea that someone had maintained a space for her all these years, had kept her memory alive in such a tangible way, was both comforting and heartbreaking, proof that she had mattered to someone, even when she'd felt completely forgotten by the world. "I used to imagine what you'd look like as you grew up," Robert continued, his voice growing softer as he shared the private rituals that had kept him sane during the darkest periods of his search. "I'd see girls your age at the mall or in restaurants and wonder if one of them might be you, if I'd somehow walk past my own daughter without recognizing her." The confession was painful in its honesty, revealing the depth of his obsession with finding her and the way it had colored every aspect of his life for more than 2 decades. Emily's own confession came haltingly, each word carefully chosen as she tried to explain what it had been like to grow up believing she was unwanted, to construct an identity from nothing but fragments and assumptions about who she might have been if things had been different. "I used to make up stories about you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, as she shared secrets she'd never told anyone, not even the therapists who had tried to help her process her abandonment issues over the years. "I'd imagine that you were a soldier who died in a war or a doctor who was killed in a car accident because it was easier to believe you were dead than to think you just didn't want me." The words hit Robert like physical blows, each one a reminder of the damage that had been done not just to their relationship but to his daughter's fundamental sense of self-worth, and he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from reaching across and pulling her into his arms. "Sometimes I'd pretend that you were looking for me, but couldn't find me because I was hidden too well, and I'd leave little signs wherever I went, drawings of stars, notes with my name on them, hoping that somehow you'd see them and know I was there." Emily's voice broke on the last words as she remembered the desperate hope that had driven those small acts of faith, the way she'd clung to the possibility that someone, somewhere, was searching for her with the same intensity that she was searching for them. The image of his daughter leaving breadcrumbs for a father who was indeed looking for her, but could never find the trail, was almost too much for Robert to bear, and he felt tears streaming down his face as he realized how close they'd come to finding each other so many times without ever making the connection. The conversation turned to practical matters as they both struggled to process the emotional weight of their reunion, discussing the logistics of how they might begin to rebuild their relationship without overwhelming each other or moving too fast for either of them to handle. "I don't want your money," Emily said suddenly, her voice firm with the kind of pride that had carried her through years of struggle and self-reliance. "I've made it this far on my own, and I need to know that whatever happens between us isn't about what you can give me financially." Robert nodded slowly, understanding that his wealth, which had been both a blessing and a curse in his search for her, would now become another obstacle to overcome as they tried to build trust between them. "I respect that," he said, his voice filled with admiration for the strength and independence she'd developed in his absence. "But I hope you'll let me help with your education at least. Not because you need it, but because it's something I should have been doing all along. Something any father would want to do for his daughter." The offer hung between them like a bridge they weren't sure they were ready to cross, loaded with implications about dependency and obligation and the complex dynamics of a relationship that was both brand new and 23 years in the making. Emily considered his words carefully, weighing her fierce independence against the practical reality of her situation, and the growing understanding that accepting help didn't necessarily mean sacrificing her autonomy or her hard-won sense of self. "Maybe we could start small," she said finally, her voice tentative but hopeful. "Maybe we could just try having dinner together once a week, getting to know each other as the people we are now, not just the people we used to be." The suggestion seemed to unlock something in both of them, a recognition that they didn't have to solve everything in one conversation, that rebuilding their relationship would be a process that required patience and understanding and the willingness to forgive each other for the ways they'd both been damaged by their separation. "I'd like that," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion as he realized that his daughter was offering him something more precious than all his business deals combined. A chance to earn his place in her life, to prove that he was worthy of being called her father. "I'd like that very much." They spent the next hour sharing stories about their separate lives, filling in the gaps that had opened between them like chasms, learning about the people they'd become in each other's absence, and discovering that despite everything that had happened, they still shared fundamental values and dreams that connected them across the years of separation. Emily told him about her favorite books and her plans to teach elementary school, about the small apartment she'd worked so hard to afford and the garden she was trying to grow on her fire escape, and Robert shared stories about his business empire and his charitable foundation, about the empty mansion he'd built as a monument to his success, but which had never felt like a home without her in it. The conversation was tentative and careful, both of them testing the waters of this new relationship, but underneath the caution was a growing sense of recognition, a feeling that despite all the years and all the pain, they were still fundamentally connected by something stronger than time or circumstance. As the afternoon wore on and the restaurant began to prepare for the dinner service, they both realized that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey, that healing the wounds of their separation would take time and effort, and a willingness to be vulnerable with each other in ways that neither of them had experienced in decades. "I'm scared," Emily admitted as they prepared to leave, her honesty cutting through the careful politeness they'd maintained throughout their conversation. "I'm scared that this is too good to be true, that I'll wake up tomorrow and find out it was all a dream, or that you'll change your mind and decide I'm not worth the trouble after all." Robert's heart broke at the vulnerability in her voice, at the evidence of how deeply her abandonment issues ran, and how much work it would take to convince her that she was safe to love him without fear of being left again. "I'm scared too," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm scared that I'll say the wrong thing or move too fast, or somehow drive you away before we've had a chance to really know each other. But I'm more scared of losing you again, of letting fear keep us apart when we've already lost so much time." The honesty between them was raw and necessary, a foundation of truth on which they could begin to build something real and lasting. And as they exchanged phone numbers and made plans for their first official dinner together, both of them felt the fragile stirrings of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other, despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. Subscribe to follow their journey as they navigate the complex path from strangers to family, learning to trust and love again after decades of separation. The silence stretched between them like a chasm carved by decades of absence, each second heavy with the weight of 23 years that had passed without a single word, without a single embrace, without the simple knowledge that the other still breathed in this world. Robert's hands trembled as he reached toward Emily, his fingers stopping just inches from her face, afraid that touching her might shatter this impossible moment like glass against stone. The restaurant around them had become a cathedral of whispers, every patron leaning forward to catch fragments of this reunion that defied all logic and reason. Emily's eyes, those unmistakable mirrors of his own soul, searched his face for answers to questions she had carried since childhood, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as the reality of who he was settled into her bones like winter cold. The tattoo on her exposed arm seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, the delicate lines of the phoenix rising from ashes now taking on a meaning so profound it made Robert's chest ache with recognition. This was the symbol he had drawn for her on countless bedtime stories, the mythical bird that would always find its way home, no matter how far it had flown, no matter how lost it had become in the darkness of the world. He remembered tracing those same lines on her tiny palm when she was barely 3 years old, promising her that even if they were ever separated, the phoenix would guide them back to each other. The cruel irony that she had chosen to mark her skin with this very symbol, not knowing it was a breadcrumb trail leading back to him, made his throat close with emotion so raw it threatened to break him completely. Every line of ink on her arm was a testament to a connection that had survived abandonment, poverty, and the relentless march of time itself. "I searched for you," Robert whispered, his voice cracking like autumn leaves underfoot, each word carrying the weight of sleepless nights and hired investigators who had come back empty-handed year after year. "Every day for 23 years, I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping that somewhere in this vast world, my little girl was still alive, still breathing, still carrying a piece of my heart with her." The confession spilled from him like water from a broken dam, decades of guilt and regret flooding the space between them, with a truth so painful it made his knees weak. Emily's face crumpled as she absorbed his words, her own memories of wondering about her father, of creating elaborate fantasies about why he had never come for her, colliding with the reality that he had been searching all along. The foster homes, the group facilities, the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering if she was worth loving, all of it suddenly reframed by the knowledge that someone had been looking, someone had cared enough to never give up. The other diners had begun to pull out their phones, the modern instinct to document and share overriding any sense of privacy or respect for this sacred moment of reunion. Robert noticed the cameras turning toward them and felt a surge of protective fury that made his jaw clench. The same instinct that had driven him to build walls around his heart, now redirecting itself toward shielding Emily from the hungry eyes of strangers. He moved closer to her, his body creating a barrier between his daughter and the world that would try to consume this moment, to turn their pain and joy into entertainment for the masses. Emily seemed oblivious to the attention, her focus entirely consumed by the man before her, this stranger who claimed to be the father she had dreamed about and resented in equal measure. Her hands moved unconsciously to cover the tattoo, as if protecting the symbol that had just revealed the most important secret of her life. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, but each word cut through Robert like a blade, forged from 23 years of abandonment and longing. The question hung between them like a sword, sharp and unforgiving, demanding an answer that could never fully heal the wounds that time and separation had carved into both their souls. Robert's face contorted with anguish as he struggled to find words that could possibly explain the labyrinth of legal battles, false leads, and bureaucratic walls that had kept him from her. The system that had swallowed a 3-year-old girl and hidden her so completely that even unlimited resources couldn't bring her home. He thought of the private investigators who had chased ghosts across continents, the sleepless nights spent staring at age progression photos that never quite captured the essence of the child he remembered, the moments when he had almost given up hope entirely. The weight of those failures pressed down on him now, each missed opportunity and dead end, feeling like a personal betrayal of the promise he had made to always protect her. The torn sleeve of Emily's uniform fluttered slightly in the air conditioning, a physical reminder of the violence that had preceded this miraculous discovery, the anger that had driven Robert to lash out at a stranger who turned out to be the most important person in his world. He stared at the fabric hanging loose around her arm, shame washing over him in waves as he realized how close he had come to walking away without ever knowing the truth, how his own rage and entitlement had nearly cost him the only thing that truly mattered. Emily followed his gaze to her damaged uniform, her fingers touching the torn material with a mixture of wonder and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite process that this moment of destruction had become the catalyst for the most important discovery of her life. The phoenix tattoo seemed to glow in the restaurant's harsh lighting, its wings spread wide as if ready to carry them both toward a future neither had dared to imagine possible. Subscribe to witness how a father and daughter begin to rebuild a bond that was broken by forces beyond their control, but strengthened by a love that refused to die. The manager of the restaurant hovered nearby like a nervous bird, his eyes darting between the billionaire whose anger had nearly destroyed his establishment and the waitress who had just been revealed as something far more precious than any of them had imagined. Robert's security team had materialized from the shadows where they always lurked, their presence creating an invisible barrier around the table while their trained eyes scanned for threats that might emerge from this unexpected vulnerability. Emily found herself caught between two worlds, the harsh reality of minimum wage survival that had defined her entire adult life, and the impossible luxury of a father whose wealth could reshape her existence with a single phone call. The contrast felt surreal, like stepping from black and white into technicolor, and she struggled to reconcile the man before her with the fantasies she had constructed during lonely nights in foster care. Robert's mind raced through fragments of memory, trying to piece together the child he had lost with the young woman sitting across from him, searching for traces of the little girl who had once fallen asleep in his arms while he read her stories about brave princesses and magical kingdoms. Her laugh, when it finally came in response to something he said about her resemblance to her mother, was like hearing a song he thought he had forgotten, a melody that had been locked away in the deepest chambers of his heart for over 2 decades. The sound broke something loose inside him, a dam of grief and longing that he had built to survive the years of not knowing, and tears began to flow down his cheeks without shame or apology. Emily watched this powerful man crumble before her, his vulnerability so raw and unexpected that it shattered every preconception she had held about wealthy people and their capacity for genuine emotion. The other restaurant patrons had begun to whisper among themselves, creating a buzz of speculation and excitement that threatened to transform this private moment into a public spectacle. Robert could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, the familiar sensation of being watched and judged that came with his position in the world. But for the first time in years, he found himself not caring about appearances or reputation. All that mattered was the young woman across from him, this miracle wrapped in a torn uniform and carrying his DNA in every cell of her being. Emily shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, her instincts telling her to flee from this attention that felt both overwhelming and dangerous. But something deeper kept her rooted in place. The desperate need to understand where she had come from, to finally have answers to the questions that had haunted her entire life. "Tell me about her," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. But Robert heard every syllable as clearly as if she had shouted across a canyon. He knew immediately that she was asking about her mother, the woman whose absence had created the second great wound in his life. The loss that had driven him to build walls so high that even his own daughter couldn't scale them when she needed him most. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. Sarah's laugh that could light up a room, her fierce protectiveness when it came to their daughter, the way she had fought the cancer with a courage that had both inspired and terrified him. He had never spoken about Sarah to anyone, not in all the years since her death, but something about Emily's desperate need to know made the words flow like water, finding its natural course toward the sea. Robert began to paint a picture of the mother Emily had never known, describing Sarah's passion for art and her ability to find beauty in the smallest details of everyday life, the way she had sung lullabies in 3 different languages and insisted on reading bedtime stories with different voices for every character. Emily absorbed every word, like a desert drinking rain, her eyes wide with wonder as she learned about the woman who had given her life, who had loved her fiercely for 3 precious years before cancer stole her away and left a grieving widower to raise a daughter alone. The knowledge that she had been wanted, that she had been cherished by a mother who had fought to stay with her as long as possible, began to heal wounds that Emily hadn't even realized were still bleeding. Robert's voice grew stronger as he spoke about Sarah, the love in his words so palpable that it seemed to fill the space between them with warmth and light. The revelation of her mother's story opened floodgates in Emily's memory, fragments of dreams and half-remembered sensations suddenly taking on new meaning as she realized they might be actual memories rather than wishful thinking. She remembered the scent of lavender and paint, the feeling of gentle hands braiding her hair, the sound of a woman's voice singing softly in the darkness when nightmares came calling. These precious fragments, dismissed for years as imagination or false memories, implanted by well-meaning foster parents, now revealed themselves as the last gifts her mother had left her, proof that she had been loved completely and unconditionally for the first 3 years of her life. The weight of this knowledge was both devastating and healing, a bittersweet recognition that she had lost something precious, but had also carried it with her all along, embedded in her very soul, like the phoenix tattoo that had brought her home. Subscribe to discover how the revelation of her mother's love begins to heal wounds that have festered for 23 years, and how a father learns to forgive himself for failures beyond his control. Robert's voice grew heavy with the weight of bureaucratic nightmares as he began to explain the labyrinth that had swallowed his 3-year-old daughter and hidden her from him for over 2 decades. His hands clenching into fists as he relived the frustration of fighting a system designed to protect children, but that had instead become a prison of red tape and incompetence. The social workers had arrived like vultures in the aftermath of Sarah's death, their clipboards and concerned expressions masking a machinery that would tear his family apart with ruthless efficiency, declaring him an unfit father based on his grief and his demanding work schedule. Emily listened with growing horror as he described the emergency custody hearing that had taken place while he was traveling for business, the legal proceedings that had stripped him of his parental rights before he even knew they were in jeopardy, the way the system had painted his wealth and frequent travel as evidence of neglect rather than his desperate attempt to provide for his daughter's future. The injustice of it burned in her chest like acid, the knowledge that she had been stolen from a father who had loved her and wanted her, condemned to a childhood of institutions and temporary homes because bureaucrats had decided that grief made him dangerous. The foster care system had swallowed Emily like a great beast, moving her from home to home with such frequency that she had learned to pack her few belongings in minutes, to never get too attached to bedrooms or families or the illusion of permanence. Robert's investigators had chased paper trails that led nowhere, following false names and sealed records through a maze of agencies that seemed designed to lose children rather than protect them, each dead end another nail in the coffin of his hope. Emily's records had been buried under layers of bureaucracy. Her identity changed multiple times as she moved through the system, the phoenix tattoo becoming the only constant marker of who she really was beneath the shifting names and case numbers. The irony that she had chosen to mark herself with the very symbol her father had given her, not knowing it would one day lead her home, felt like the universe's cruel joke played out over decades of separation and longing. "I hired the best investigators money could buy," Robert continued, his voice breaking as he described the armies of private detectives who had scoured the country looking for any trace of his lost daughter, the false leads that had sent him racing across continents only to find other people's children who bore no resemblance to the little girl he remembered. The age progression photos had become his obsession, updated every year as he tried to imagine how Emily might look as she grew from child to teenager to young woman, but none of them had captured the fierce intelligence in her eyes or the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the hardships she had endured. Emily felt a strange mixture of anger and sympathy as she realized that while she had been dreaming of a father who might come to rescue her, he had been spending fortunes trying to find her. Both of them trapped in a nightmare of separation that neither had chosen. The knowledge that he had never stopped looking, never given up hope even when logic suggested she might be dead, began to crack the shell of resentment she had built around her heart. The restaurant around them had become a bubble of intimacy despite the crowd of onlookers, their conversation creating a sacred space where 23 years of pain could finally be acknowledged and examined in the harsh light of truth. Emily found herself studying Robert's face for traces of the father she had imagined, comparing his weathered features to the idealized figure she had constructed in her dreams, surprised to find that reality was both more complex and more human than her fantasies had allowed. His grief was written in the lines around his eyes, the weight of guilt and regret carved into his features like a map of suffering that she was only beginning to understand. The realization that he had carried this pain for as long as she had, that his wealth and power had been useless against the bureaucratic forces that had kept them apart, began to shift her perspective on the man she had resented for abandoning her. Robert pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through hundreds of photos that documented his search for her. Pictures of other young women who had briefly given him hope, screenshots of social media profiles he had studied for hours, looking for familiar features, images of the age progression photos that had become his only connection to the daughter he had lost. Emily watched in amazement as he showed her the evidence of his obsession, the digital breadcrumbs of a search that had consumed his life and driven him to the edge of madness more than once. There were photos of him at children's hospitals and schools, following leads that had seemed promising but led nowhere, his face growing more haggard and desperate with each passing year. The depth of his commitment to finding her was overwhelming, a testament to a love that had survived separation and uncertainty, that had refused to accept defeat even when hope seemed impossible. The weight of understanding began to settle over Emily like a heavy blanket, the knowledge that she had not been abandoned but stolen, not forgotten but desperately sought, not unloved but cherished by a father who had moved heaven and earth trying to bring her home. The anger she had carried for so long began to transform into something else, a grief for the years they had lost, a rage at the system that had kept them apart, and underneath it all, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to build something from the ashes of their shattered family. Robert reached across the table and gently touched her hand, his fingers tracing the phoenix tattoo that had revealed her identity, both of them marveling at the cosmic coincidence that had brought them together in this unlikely place, at this impossible moment when all hope had seemed lost. Subscribe to witness how the truth about their separation begins to heal old wounds while opening new questions about what it means to be family after decades apart. Emily explains the tattoo. 18, broke, pulled by a symbol she couldn't name. Flames, wings, a map she felt more than remembered. Robert hears the echo of bedtime promises he once drew in pen on a child's palm. The manager hovers. Security shifts. Emily sees the gulf between double shifts and men with earpieces. Robert offers, too quickly, "Come home." The word lands heavy. Home could mean rescue or disappearance into someone else's life. She wants privacy, pace, dignity. He understands and slows down. Co-workers whisper from the doorway. Emily feels the ground tilting. Wealth could fix rent, not identity. They choose a quieter place to talk. The phoenix catches the light as they leave. Less prophecy, more permission. They can rise, but only if they carry who they've become. In the car, silence holds. No longer hostile, simply full. The city slides by. Possibility sits between them. Robert's penthouse is immaculate and airless. Luxury hums. Warmth is missing. Staff move with practiced care. One housekeeper lingers. She's seen Emily's photo for years, taught to look for a face that might arrive any day. The search wasn't just his. The house itself has been waiting. On a wall, Robert's life in frames. Awards, galas, smiles that never quite reach his eyes. No other children, no replacements. Stopped time. He opens a door. A bedroom, hers, kept and updated through seasons she never lived there to see. Pastel walls, phoenix murals, layered year after year. Clothes sized along an imagined growth chart, a shrine and a welcome. Emily touches paint that mirrors her tattoo. Tears come, not for abandonment, but for endurance. In that room, the story changes tense. They don't reclaim 23 years. They claim the next hour, then the next, rising, not reborn as who they were, but as who they are, together.